The champagne was lukewarm, the smiles were brittle, and the air in the Brooks Manor smelled like expensive perfume covering up a basement leak. I stood by the buffet table, meticulously dissecting a shrimp cocktail while watching my sister, Rina, hold court in the center of the ballroom. She was wearing a dress that probably cost more than my first year of culinary school, the school our mother Veda had refused to pay for because chopping onions wasn't a legacy. Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible Reddit stories. It was the Brooks Development Group's 30th anniversary, a milestone of 3 decades spent overcharging tenants and shaking hands with the right city council members. I wasn't supposed to be here. My invitation had been lost in the mail, an administrative error that happened to coincide with Rina being named the sole successor to the family firm. But I've always been good at navigating back entrances. When you spend your life being shoved out the front door, you learn where the service hinges need oiling. "Kellen," a voice sighed behind me. It was a sound like dry parchment rubbing together. I turned, putting on my best prodigal son smirk. My father, Cedric, stood there, looking every bit the passive architect of his own irrelevance. He adjusted his silk tie, his eyes darting around to see if anyone was watching us. "Dad, you look like you're waiting for a subpoena," I said, popping the shrimp into my mouth. "Relax, I'm just here for the catering. Though honestly, the vinaigrette is broken. Whoever you hired doesn't understand emulsification." "You shouldn't be here," he whispered, his voice taut. "Your mother is already on edge. Rina's big announcement is in 20 minutes. Don't make a scene." "I never make scenes, Dad. I orchestrate experiences. There's a difference." I watched him walk away, his shoulders hunched. He was a man who had spent 24 years watching Veda and Rina rewrite history, usually with me as the villain. I looked back at the center of the room. Memory is a funny thing. It doesn't fade, it just sharpens until it can draw a line across your skin. I was 15, standing on the driveway of this very house, my belongings stuffed into 2 garbage bags that were leaking in the downpour. Rina had stood on the porch, wrapped in a cashmere blanket, watching with a look of bored triumph. She had told Veda I'd stolen the antique watch collection from the study to buy supplies for some imaginary rebellion. Veda hadn't asked for proof. She'd just pointed toward the gate. The image of the iron bars slamming shut while the rain turned my clothes into a second, colder skin was the emotional wallpaper of my entire adult life. Now, 9 years later, the wallpaper was being stripped. I moved through the crowd, a ghost in a well-tailored suit I'd bought with the meager savings from my bistro job. I was invisible to these people because I wasn't useful to them. That was their first mistake. I slipped into the hallway leading to the executive offices, the carpet swallowing the sound of my footsteps. The Brooks legacy was built on a foundation of absolute integrity, which was family code for shred the evidence before the audit. I knew where the auxiliary server room was. I'd spent my teenage years hiding in these vents to escape Veda's critiques of my posture. I reached the heavy oak door of the main office and paused. I could hear voices. "He's going to be a problem, Rina," a male voice said. Marcus Lang. He was the family's golden boy consultant, a man whose teeth were too white and whose soul was likely a spreadsheet. "Kellen? Please." Rina's voice was sharp, dismissive. "He's a line cook. He has the social standing of a head of lettuce. Once the papers are signed tonight, the offshore accounts are officially under my name. He gets nothing, not even the scraps." "And the Talren land?" Marcus asked. "If he finds out Veda transferred his inheritance portion into the firm's holding company to cover the losses from the mall project." "He won't find out," Rina snapped. "He's too busy making soup to understand real estate law. Mother made sure his name was scrubbed from the trust years ago. He's a non-entity." I leaned against the wall, a slow, cold heat spreading through my chest. It wasn't anger. Anger is impulsive. This was something far more structural. They hadn't just kicked me out. They'd been harvesting my future to pay for their failures. The Talren land was my grandmother's legacy, the one thing she'd promised would be my start in the world. I checked my watch. 7:45 p.m. The presentation was at 8 p.m. I didn't enter the room. I didn't burst in with accusations. That's what a 15-year-old would do. Instead, I moved further down the hall to the security hub. The technician was away, likely grabbing a plate of that broken vinaigrette. I sat down at the console. My fingers moved over the keys with the practiced ease of someone who had spent months studying the firm's digital architecture. I wasn't here to break things. I was here to rearrange them. I bypassed the firewall, the password was Rina's birthday because of course it was, and accessed the presentation folder for the night's gala. It was a polished slideshow, full of graphs showing unprecedented growth, and photos of Rina looking visionary. I didn't delete it. That would be too obvious. Instead, I inserted 3 small files. 3 scanned documents from the Talren land transfer folder I'd found earlier. I set them to play as a looped background during the final toast. Then, I went to the climate control settings. The ballroom was currently a comfortable 70 degrees. I dialed it down to 55. If they wanted to be cold-hearted, they might as well have the atmosphere to match. I stepped back into the ballroom just as the lights dimmed. Veda was on the stage now, looking like a queen regent in silver silk. She held a microphone, her voice projecting a warmth she had never once directed toward her son. 30 years ago, Veda began, her gaze sweeping over the elite of the city, this family made a promise of stability, growth, and loyalty. Tonight, as I prepare to hand the reins to my daughter, Rina, we reaffirm that loyalty. Rina walked onto the stage, beaming. The applause was thunderous. I stood at the very back, leaning against a marble pillar, my arms crossed. We've faced challenges, Rina said, her voice practiced and steady, but a Brooks always protects the foundation. We don't let anything or anyone compromise our future. I saw Marcus in the wings, looking smug. I saw my father in the front row, looking at his shoes. And now, Rina continued, I'd like to share our vision for the next decade. She clicked a remote. The large screen behind her flickered to life. The first slide was the company logo. The second slide was a graph of projected earnings. The third slide, however, was a high-resolution scan of a signature page. It was my grandmother's signature, shaky and dated 3 days before she passed. Below it was a secondary signature, Veda's, notarizing a transfer of land in the absence of the primary heir. The room went silent. Not a sudden silence, but a creeping, confused hush that started at the front and rolled back like a fog. Rina didn't notice at first. She was still talking about strategic acquisitions. As you can see by our diversification, Rina said, gesturing toward the screen. She finally turned her head. Her words died in her throat. The next slide appeared. A bank statement showing a massive transfer from the trust account to a private holding company registered in the Cayman Islands under Rina's middle name. The guests began to whisper. These were people who understood financial malfeasance as a language. They didn't see a family feud. They saw a liability. I watched Veda's face. The silver-haired matriarch went pale, her hand tightening around the microphone until the feedback whined through the speakers. She looked out into the crowd, her eyes searching. For the first time in 9 years, she saw me. I didn't wave, I didn't shout. I simply raised my glass of lukewarm champagne in a silent toast. The air in the room was getting colder by the second. People were pulling their coats tighter, shifting uncomfortably as the temperature dropped toward 50 degrees. The experience had officially begun. Rina scrambled for the remote, clicking it frantically, but I'd locked the sequence. The screen now displayed a memo from Marcus Lang to Veda Brooks, discussing the final removal of the Brooks male heir from all digital and physical ledgers to ensure a clean transition. The scandal wasn't the theft, it was the exposure. In this room, being a thief was acceptable, being caught was the only sin. There seems to be a technical glitch, Veda said, her voice cracking. If everyone could please head toward the dining hall. But no one moved. They were too busy staring at the evidence of a family eating its own. I turned and walked toward the exit. The heavy oak doors felt lighter as I pushed them open. Behind me, I could hear the muffled sound of Rina's voice rising in a screech of panic and the low, judgmental murmur of the city's elite. As I reached the driveway, the evening air was crisp. I didn't have a car. I'd taken the bus, but the walk felt shorter than usual. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A text from an unknown number, likely Marcus. What did you do? I didn't reply. I just looked up at the manor, the lights flickering as the electrical system I'd slightly overwhelmed began to protest. The Brooks family was a house of cards, and I had just realized that the wind was finally blowing in my direction. I walked toward the gate, the iron bars standing open this time. I wasn't the boy in the rain anymore. I was the one who knew how to make it pour. This was only the first course, and I had a feeling the rest of the menu was going to be very hard for them to swallow. The morning after the gala felt like the first deep breath I'd taken since I was 15. I sat in the window of my tiny apartment, nursing a cup of coffee that actually tasted like coffee rather than the industrial sludge they served at the manor. Outside, the city was waking up, unaware that the Brooks dynasty was currently scrambling to find enough duct tape to hold their reputation together. My phone had been vibrating with enough frequency to dance across the laminate tabletop, a frantic rhythmic buzzing that signaled the onset of total panic from the other side of town. I didn't answer. There is a specific kind of power in silence. It allows the imagination of your opponent to construct far worse scenarios than anything you could actually say. My kitchen was a cramped sanctuary of stainless steel and sharp edges. It was the only place where I felt in total control. In a kitchen, if you follow the logic of heat and chemistry, you get a predictable result. My family, however, was a recipe that had been spoiled for generations. I spent an hour sharpening my knives, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone providing a much-needed meditation. I wasn't just a chef, I was a student of pressure. I knew exactly how much heat a structure could take before it warped. The first step of the day wasn't a confrontation, it was a reconnaissance mission. I needed to see the cracks in person. I took the bus across town to the warehouse district where the Brooks Development Group kept its main equipment and luxury fleet. Rina loved her symbols of status. She owned a customized Italian sports car that was less of a vehicle and more of a rolling ego. It was parked in the private bay, gleaming under the fluorescent lights of the garage. I'd kept my old key fob from my brief stint as an intern during my teenage years. I wasn't surprised it still worked. Veda and Rina were so convinced of their own superiority that they never bothered with the mundane details of security updates. They assumed the world was too afraid of them to ever bite back. I stepped into the cool, oil-scented air of the garage, my footsteps echoing against the concrete. Rina's car was a masterpiece of engineering, and I was about to make it a masterpiece of psychological warfare. I didn't scratch the paint, I didn't break a window, those were the actions of a common vandal. Instead, I opened the driver's side door and began to rearrange the interior. I moved the seat forward by exactly 2 inches. I adjusted the mirrors just enough to be useless. I changed the radio presets to a station that played nothing but eerie, atmospheric jazz. Then, I took a small silver thumb drive, empty but labeled Trust Accounts Part 2, and left it sitting right in the center of the leather seat. It was a small seed of paranoia. She would spend the rest of the day wondering how I got in, what I had taken, and what was on that drive. Panic is a cumulative weight. You don't need to drop a boulder on someone, you just need to keep adding pebbles until their knees buckle. As I left the garage, I ran into Marcus Lang. He was stepping out of his own sedan, looking like he hadn't slept a wink. His expensive suit was wrinkled, and his hair, usually plastered to his head with the precision of a helmet, was fraying at the edges. He stopped when he saw me. "Kellen," he said, his voice reaching for an authority it no longer possessed. "What are you doing here? You're trespassing. I could call the police." "You could," I said, leaning against the doorframe with a casualness that clearly irritated him. "But then we'd have to talk about those Cayman accounts that were on the big screen last night. I'm not sure the authorities would stop at a trespassing charge once they start pulling those threads. How's the damage control going, Marcus? You look like you've been trying to hold back a tidal wave with a cocktail umbrella." Marcus took a step toward me, his face reddening. "You think you're smart, don't you? You think a few leaked documents change anything? Veda is already calling in favors. By next week, this will be a unfortunate technical glitch, and you'll be back in the gutter where you belong." "That's the thing about the gutter, Marcus. You learn how to see the underside of everything. You'd be surprised what people drop down there." I stepped closer, lowering my voice. "I know about the mall project. I know about the structural shortcuts you took to save 3% on the margins. I'm wondering if the city inspectors would find that as unfortunate as the gala presentation." The color drained from his face. It was a beautiful transition, like watching a sunset in reverse. He opened his mouth to retort, but no words came out. He was an opportunist, and opportunists are notoriously bad at handling people who have nothing left to lose. "I have a meeting," he finally sputtered, turning on his heel and retreating toward the office elevators. I watched him go, feeling a cold spark of satisfaction. Marcus was a link in the chain, and he was already beginning to stretch. I spent the afternoon at a small, cluttered cafe run by my mentor, Chef Andre. Andre was a man who had survived 3 recessions and a divorce by being the most stubborn person in the room. He didn't ask questions about the news reports or why my family's name was being dragged through the local business journals. He just handed me a bag of high-grade flour and told me to start kneading. "You have the eyes of a man who is looking for a fight, Kellen," Andre said, not looking up from his prep station. "I'm not looking for a fight, Andre. I'm looking for a resolution," I replied, my hands working the dough with rhythmic intensity. "Be careful. People who have everything to lose tend to burn the whole house down rather than let someone else sit at the table." "I'm not looking to sit at their table. I'm looking to take the legs out from under it." While I worked, I checked my emails. I had a message from Tara Felton, my cousin. She was the only one in the family who had ever sent me a birthday card after I was kicked out, though she usually did it in secret. "Kellen, the house is a disaster," she wrote. "Veda is throwing things. Rina is convinced you've bugged the manor. They're meeting with the lawyers tonight at 8. Be careful. Rina mentioned Marcus has a plan to handle your claims." I deleted the email. A plan to handle me. It was so predictably corporate. They couldn't imagine a world where I wasn't motivated by money or a seat at the board. They thought they could buy my silence or intimidate me into a corner. They didn't realize that my childhood had been one long masterclass in their intimidation tactics. I was immune to it now. I spent the evening setting up my next move. I wasn't just targeting their bank accounts, I was targeting their competence. The Brooks name was synonymous with reliability, and I was going to turn it into a punchline. I spent hours on my laptop, navigating the back end of the city's vendor portal. My family had a contract for the upcoming Founders' Day catering and logistics, a massive public event that was supposed to be Rina's grand debut as the new head of the firm. It was a simple matter of rerouting some delivery schedules. The gourmet seafood wouldn't be arriving at the manor. It would be delivered to a local homeless shelter under the Brooks name as an anonymous charitable donation. The high-end linens were being sent to a veterinary clinic 3 towns over. By the time Rina realized the supplies were missing, she'd be standing in front of 500 of the city's most influential people with nothing to serve but excuses. As I worked, my inner monologue provided a running commentary on the sheer absurdity of it all. They had spent decades building a fortress out of lies and stolen legacies, and it was all falling apart because they couldn't be bothered to change a password or treat a 15-year-old with a modicum of dignity. It was a farce, and I was the director. Around midnight, I decided to take a walk. I found myself standing across the street from the Brooks Manor. It was a monstrosity of stone and glass, glowing like a tomb in the moonlight. I could see shadows moving behind the heavy curtains of the library, the lawyers, no doubt, trying to find a legal way to erase the truth. I felt a sudden sharp presence behind me. I didn't turn around immediately. I waited, listening to the crunch of gravel. "You always did like to watch from the shadows," a voice said. I turned. It was my father. Cedric looked older than he had 24 hours ago. He was wearing an old cardigan, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He looked less like a tycoon and more like a man who had lost his way in his own house. "It's a good vantage point," I said. "You see things people miss when they're standing in the spotlight." "Kellen, stop this," he said, his voice weary. She's not well. Rina is a mess. Whatever you think you're gaining, it's not worth the destruction of your own family." "My family?" I let out a short, dry laugh. "My family stood on the porch and watched me walk away in a storm when I was 15. My family stole my inheritance to cover up their bad business deals. You didn't seem too concerned about destruction when it was my life being leveled, Dad." "I didn't know the extent of it," he whispered. I thought you would find your own way. I thought it would make you stronger." "It did, just not the kind of strong you can control." I stepped closer to him. "You've spent your whole life being a spectator in your own home. Why start participating now?" He looked at the house, then back at me. There was a flicker of something in his eyes. Not anger, but a profound, hollow sadness. "Because I know how this ends, Kellen. Nobody wins a war like this. You just end up standing in the rubble alone." "I've been standing in the rubble alone for 9 years, Dad. I've grown quite fond of the view." He sighed, shaking his head. "Marcus is dangerous when he's cornered. He's not like us. He doesn't have a conscience to appeal to. He's looking for a way to discredit you permanently. He's been digging into your time in the city, looking for any mistake, any slip-up." "Let him dig," I said, beginning to walk away. "He might find some of the bodies he helped bury." I didn't look back as I walked away. My father's warning was a pebble in my shoe, annoying, but not enough to stop my stride. I knew Marcus was an opportunist, and I knew he was desperate. That made him predictable. When I got back to my apartment, I saw a black SUV parked across the street. It wasn't a car I recognized, but the tinted windows and the way it was positioned, idling quietly in the dark, told me everything I needed to know. The game was escalating. They weren't just trying to ignore me anymore. They were watching me. I went upstairs, locked my door, and sat in the dark. My sarcastic inner voice, usually so loud and mocking, was quiet for a moment. I thought about the Talren land, the smell of the pines where my grandmother used to take me, and the way the sun looked hitting the creek. They had taken that from me. They had turned a memory of peace into a line item on a balance sheet. I pulled out my phone and looked at the final file I'd gathered. It was a recording of a meeting from 6 months ago. Marcus and Rina discussing how to phase out Cedric once the succession was complete. They weren't just betraying me, they were devouring each other. I smiled to myself as I watched the SUV through the slats of my blinds. They thought they were the hunters. They didn't realize that in my kitchen, I was the one who controlled the flame. The cliffhanger wasn't what they were going to do to me. The cliffhanger was what I was going to let them think they had achieved before I pulled the rug out for the final time. I had Marcus exactly where I wanted him. Scared, desperate and convinced he was still in charge. I closed my eyes, planning the next disruption. Tomorrow was Founders' Day. Tomorrow, the city would see the Brooks family for exactly what they were, and I would be there, right in the front row, tasting every bit of it. The morning of Founders' Day arrived with a sky the color of a tarnished silver spoon. It was the kind of atmosphere that felt heavy with impending rain, yet stayed dry enough to keep everyone's nerves on edge. I spent the early hours in the back of a delivery van I'd rented under a shell company name. To the world, I was just another logistic contractor. To the Brooks family, I was becoming the phantom in their machine. My sarcastic inner monologue was currently providing a play-by-play commentary on the sheer incompetence of Marcus Lang, who was visible through my binoculars as he stood on the steps of the City Hall Plaza, screaming into a sleek titanium phone. Marcus was a man who lived and breathed for optics. Today, the optics were failing him. I watched as he paced, his expensive leather shoes clicking frantically against the stone. He was clearly looking for the premium seafood crates and the Egyptian cotton linens that were, at this very moment, being unloaded at the St. Jude's Community Center and the county animal shelter. I could almost feel the vibration of his frustration from across the street. It was a culinary masterpiece of a different sort, the slow-cooked breakdown of a man who realized he had lost the recipe. I stayed in the shadows of the van, wearing a generic gray jumpsuit and a baseball cap pulled low. I wasn't here to watch the party, I was here to watch Marcus. He was the one who held the keys to the digital vault, and more importantly, he was the one most likely to lead me to the physical evidence of the trust fund manipulation. When he finally slammed his phone shut and marched toward his sedan, I put the van in gear. The chase was exercise in subtle persistence. Marcus wasn't a getaway driver. He was a man who assumed everyone else would get out of his way. He sped through yellow lights and ignored lane markings, his driving reflecting a mind that was rapidly losing its composure. I kept 2 cars between us, navigating the city's grid with the patience of a hunter. He didn't head back to the manor. Instead, he steered toward the industrial outskirts, weaving through a labyrinth of brick warehouses and rusted shipping containers. He pulled into a secluded lot behind a decommissioned textile mill. I parked the van a block away and moved on foot, sticking to the alleyways. The air here was thick with the scent of damp concrete and old grease. I watched from behind a stack of wooden pallets as Marcus met a man in a nondescript dark windbreaker. They spoke in hushed, urgent tones. Marcus handed over a thick envelope, the universal sign for a transaction that wouldn't be appearing on any tax return. "I need those records gone, Jerry," Marcus's voice carried through the still air. "The kid is digging. He's already found the Cayman links. If he finds the original deeds to the Talren property before we can finalize the sale, we're all going to be looking at a very long vacation in a very small room." "It takes time to scrub a physical trail, Lang," the other man replied, his voice a gravelly rumble. "You can't just delete a paper deed from 1998. It's in the archives. I have to get in there, pull the ledger, and make sure the replacement looks authentic. Just do it. I don't care about the cost. Veda is breathing down my neck, and Rina is 1 step away from a total collapse. If this leaks to the press, the firm is finished." I leaned back against the cool brick, my mind racing. So the original deeds still existed. They hadn't been destroyed yet, only hidden. Veda hadn't just stolen my inheritance. She had engaged in a multi-year conspiracy to falsify public records. It was a level of commitment to betrayal that was almost impressive in its thoroughness. The meeting broke up quickly. Marcus headed back to his car, looking slightly more relieved. I waited until he was gone before making my move. I didn't care about the man in the windbreaker. He was just a tool. I cared about Marcus's car. While he had been talking, I'd noticed a slight hiss coming from his front tire, a slow leak I had conveniently initiated with a specialized valve tool while he was distracted by his phone back at the plaza. I followed him again, but this time, I knew he wouldn't get far. 3 miles down the expressway, his sedan began to wobble. He pulled over onto the shoulder, the luxury vehicle looking pathetic with a flattened tire. I pulled the van over 100 yards behind him and waited. Marcus stepped out, cursing the sky. He looked at the tire, then at his trunk. I knew for a fact that his spare was also flat. I'd taken the liberty of checking that during my garage visit the night before. He was stranded. He started to call for a tow, but the cellular reception in this particular stretch of the industrial corridor was notoriously spotty. Another detail I had accounted for when choosing my moment. He began to walk toward the nearest exit ramp, his frustration palpable in every stride. While he was away from the vehicle, I moved in. I didn't want his wallet or his phone. I wanted his laptop. It was sitting on the passenger seat, a sleek silver beast that contained the soul of the Brooks Development Group. I used a Slim Jim to pop the lock, a skill I'd picked up from a line cook named Rico who had a colorful past, and grabbed the device. I replaced it with a heavy book of similar weight, wrapped in a laptop sleeve I'd prepared. By the time Marcus returned with a look of defeated exhaustion, I was already back in the van, the laptop open and the decryption software running. It was a beautiful piece of hardware, but like the man who owned it, it was arrogant. The password hint was succession. I tried Rina's birthday first. Nothing. I tried Veda's. Nothing. Then, with a smirk, I tried the date I was kicked out of the manor. Access granted. The sheer narcissism of it was staggering. He had used the date of my greatest humiliation as a security key, likely as a private joke between him and Rina. My sarcastic inner voice wasn't laughing now. It was cold and focused. I began downloading every file related to the Talren estate, the mall project, and the various offshore accounts. But as I scrolled through the internal memos, I found something I hadn't expected. It was a thread of encrypted emails between Marcus and my father, Cedric. Cedric. We can't keep him in the dark forever. If he finds out about the insurance policy, the whole thing falls apart. Marcus. He's a chef, Cedric. He's looking at menus, not actuarial tables. As long as he stays in the city and out of the manor, the policy stays active. We need that liquidity to keep the firm afloat. I froze. An insurance policy? My father hadn't just been a passive observer. He had been a silent partner in the financial exploitation of my existence. They were using my name, my legal status as a Brooks, to maintain a high-value policy that provided the firm with its primary line of credit. I wasn't just an outcast, I was a human asset, a pawn they kept on the board only to ensure their own survival. The realization didn't make me feel small. It made me feel like an architect who had just discovered the load-bearing wall was made of cardboard. The entire Brooks empire wasn't just corrupt. It was a hollow shell, held together by my involuntary participation. I closed the laptop and sat in the silence of the van. The rain finally began to fall, a light patter against the metal roof. I looked out at the city skyline, the lights of the skyscrapers beginning to flicker on. My family thought they were playing a game of chess. They thought they had moved me off the board years ago. They didn't realize that I had moved onto a different board entirely, one where the rules of loyalty and family didn't apply. My next move had to be bigger than a disrupted gala or a flattened tire. I needed to isolate them. I needed to turn their own greed against them until they had no one left to trust. I drove back toward the city, my mind whirring with the new information. I stopped at a payphone, rare as they were, and made a call to Tara. "Kellen?" she whispered, her voice frantic. "Where are you? The plaza is a madhouse. The mayor is here, and there's no food. Rina is having a literal meltdown in the VIP tent." "Listen to me, Tara," I said, my voice calm and low. "I need you to do something. In the library, behind the third shelf of the history section, there's a small safe. I need you to find out if Cedric has been visiting it lately." "The safe? Kellen, I can't." "Tara, they're using all of us, even you. They've been leveraging the family assets to cover Marcus's gambling debts and the mall's failure. If you want to come out of this with anything left of your reputation, you need to help me see the truth." There was a long silence on the other end. "I'll check," she finally said. "But Kellen, be careful. Marcus came back to the office an hour ago. He didn't have his laptop, and he looked different. He looked like a man who was ready to do something desperate." "I'm counting on it," I said, and hung up. I spent the rest of the night in my apartment, analyzing the data from Marcus's laptop. The deeper I went, the more the layers of betrayal revealed themselves. It wasn't just about money. It was about control. Veda and Rina had built a world where they were the only ones who mattered, and everyone else, me, my father, even Marcus, was just fuel for the fire. I looked at a photo of my grandmother on my desk. She had been the only one who saw the value in a boy who preferred the kitchen to the boardroom. She had left me that land so I would always have a place to stand. And they had turned it into a line of credit for a failing mall. I felt a surge of cold, calculated energy. The sarcasm was gone now, replaced by a singular, sharp focus. I began drafting a series of anonymous tips to the city's major financial investigators, each one backed by a file from Marcus's own computer. But I didn't send them yet. I wanted to see the look on their faces when the walls finally started to close in. I went to the window and looked down at the street. The black SUV was still there, parked in the same spot, its engine idling. They were watching. They were waiting for me to make a mistake. I picked up a kitchen knife, a beautiful, well-balanced French blade, and began to slice an apple with surgical precision. I ate a piece, the tart sweetness a sharp contrast to the bitterness of the day. "Dinner is served," I whispered to the empty room. The rehook was set. I knew exactly where Marcus was going next, and I knew exactly what he would find when he got there. He thought he was handling me. He didn't realize that I was the one who had already set the table, and the main course was about to be served. The Brooks Charitable Foundation Gala was supposed to be the family's redemption arc. After the Founders' Day debacle, which the local press had gleefully dubbed the empty plate scandal, Veda had pivoted with the grace of a shark. She had funneled an obscene amount of capital into a high-profile fundraiser for the city's Historic Preservation Society. It was classic Brooks. When caught with your hand in the cookie jar, buy the cookie factory and host a black tie benefit for the flour mill. I stood in the service corridor of the Grand Starlight Hotel, wearing the white jacket and checkered pants of the hired help. My sarcastic inner monologue was currently giving a standing ovation to the sheer audacity of my family's survival instincts. They were like cockroaches in Armani. You could drop a financial bomb on them, and they'd just crawl out of the rubble complaining about the dust on their lapels. I had spent the last 48 hours embedded in the hotel's kitchen staff. In the world of high-end catering, a temporary hire with a solid knife technique and a quiet mouth is treated like gold. No one asked why I was there. No one looked twice at the guy meticulously prepping the amuse-bouche for Table 1. They didn't know that Table 1 was reserved for Veda, Rina, Marcus, and the city's lead planning commissioner. It was the inner sanctum, the place where the real deals were made over braised short ribs and vintage Bordeaux. My plan for the evening was not a blunt instrument. It was a multi-course tasting menu of psychological erosion. I had already ensured that Marcus's seating arrangement was directly under a faulty air conditioning vent that I had spiked with a concentrated solution of low-grade fish oil. It wouldn't be enough to smell up the room, but it would create a persistent, phantom odor of rot that would follow him like a guilty conscience. Every time he leaned in to whisper a bribe to the commissioner, he would be greeted by the scent of a 3-day-old wharf. I watched through the swinging doors as the room filled. The glitterati were out in force, their jewelry catching the light like a school of predatory fish. Rina looked spectacular in a dress that shimmered with emerald sequins, though her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. She kept checking her phone, likely looking for updates on the missing laptop. Marcus was beside her, looking gray and sickly. He was constantly sniffing the air, his brow furrowing as the slow drip of my olfactory sabotage began to take effect. Course 1, I whispered to myself, plating the first round of appetizers. I had replaced the standard truffle oil for the head table with a compound I'd prepared myself. It wasn't harmful, I wasn't a monster, but it was incredibly bitter, designed to linger on the back of the tongue for hours. As the servers carried the trays out, I took a position in the shadows of the mezzanine. I wanted to see the exact moment the bitterness hit. Veda took the first bite, her expression practiced and serene. Then, a microscopic twitch of her jaw. She didn't spit it out. Brooks women would rather swallow a bag of nails than show a lack of refinement in public, but her hand tightened around her silver fork until her knuckles went white. Marcus followed suit, his face contorting into a mask of sudden, profound disgust. He reached for his water, but I had already instructed the busboys, via a fake memo from management, to replace the table's sparkling water with a flat, tepid mineral brand that tasted like a rusted pipe. As the physical discomfort began to settle in, I initiated the second phase, the digital leak. I had set a timer on the laptop I'd stolen from Marcus. Using the hotel's high-speed Wi-Fi, the device began broadcasting a local signal titled Brooks Internal Audit Final. To any guest with a smartphone, which was everyone in the room, it appeared as an unsecured network. The curiosity of the social elite is a powerful engine. Within 10 minutes, I could see people at the peripheral tables leaning in, their faces illuminated by the blue light of their screens as they browsed the unsecured PDF files I'd left on the drive's root directory. These weren't the complex tax documents. These were the petty ones. Memos from Veda complaining about the low-class nature of their tenants. Rina's expense reports for charity work that consisted entirely of designer handbags. The room didn't erupt, it simmered. The whispers started at the back and moved forward like a slow-moving tide. By the time the main course was being served, the atmosphere in the ballroom had shifted from supportive to predatory. The guests were looking at the head table not with admiration, but with the calculated glee of people watching a slow-motion wreck. I moved back down to the kitchen for the main event. I needed to ensure the confrontation happened on my terms. I found Tara Felton near the service entrance. She looked terrified, her hands trembling as she smoothed her cocktail dress. "Did you find it?" I asked, my voice cutting through the clatter of the dishwashing station. "Kellen, this is insane," she hissed. "I went into the library. The safe..." "It wasn't just documents. There was a ledger, Kellen. It showed that Cedric hasn't been paying the insurance premiums. He's been redirecting the money into a separate account. He's not helping them cover the losses. He's building a lifeboat for himself." A sharp laugh escaped me. The sarcasm in my head was having a field day. So, the passive observer is actually the smartest thief in the room. He's letting Veda and Rina take the heat while he prepares to disappear with the liquid assets. He's planning to leave tonight, Tara said, her voice dropping to a whisper. I saw a flight confirmation for Zurich on his desk. He's leaving after the final toast. Not if I change the seating of the final toast, I said. I handed Tara a small, inconspicuous tablet. Go to the AV booth, tell them you're Rina's assistant and that there's a change to the tribute video for Veda. They're so overwhelmed they won't check your ID. Plug this in and hit play when the lights dim for the dessert course. What's on it? The truth, Tara. For the first time in 30 years, the Brooks family is going to be honest with each other. I returned to the mezzanine to watch the climax. The lights in the ballroom dimmed. The hum of conversation died down as the large projection screen at the front of the room descended. Veda stood up, smoothing her skirt, preparing to give the speech of her life. She looked like a monument to stability. The video started. It didn't show the montage of the Brooks architectural achievements that the AV team expected. Instead, it was a split screen. On the left was the recording I'd found on Marcus's laptop, the conversation about phasing out Cedric. On the right was the footage Tara had captured on her phone an hour ago. Cedric's open safe, the Zurich tickets, and the ledger showing the systematic draining of the firm's final reserves. The audio echoed through the high-end sound system. Rina's voice, sharp and cold. He's a ghost, Marcus. We'll keep him in the manor until the ink is dry on the succession, then we'll put him in a facility and forget he exists. Then Cedric's voice, captured in a private memo he'd recorded for his lawyer. Veda thinks I'm a coward. Let her. By the time she realizes the trust is empty, I'll be across the ocean. They can have the reputation. I'll take the gold. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of silence that has weight, a heavy, suffocating pressure that made the grand ballroom feel like a diving bell. Veda didn't move. She looked like a statue of salt. Rina turned toward her father, her face a mask of primal shock. Marcus, still smelling faintly of rotten fish and tasting the bitterness of my amuse-bouche, looked like he wanted to vanish into the floorboards. Cedric didn't look at the screen. He looked at Veda. For the first time in my life, I saw my father stand up straight. He didn't offer an apology. He didn't offer an explanation. He simply picked up his napkin, placed it on the table, and walked toward the exit. Cedric. Veda's voice was a jagged shard of glass. It wasn't the voice of a matriarch. It was the voice of a woman who had just realized her throne was made of air. He didn't stop. He walked past the shocked socialites, past the planning commissioner, and right out the gilded doors. Rina was the first to snap. She turned on Marcus, her voice rising into a shrill, uncontrolled register. You knew. You were supposed to be monitoring the accounts. You let him rob us while you were busy trying to hide a laptop. I didn't know, Marcus shouted back, his composure finally shattering. I was too busy trying to stop your brother from airing our laundry to notice your father was burning the house down. The guests weren't just watching now, they were filming. 100 smartphones were raised like digital witnesses to the total disintegration of a legacy. The planning commissioner quietly stood up and left through a side exit, his face a study in professional distance. The deal for the mall was gone. The succession was a joke. The Brooks Development Group was now just a collection of people who hated each other, trapped in a cold room that smelled like old fish. I stepped out of the shadows of the mezzanine and made my way down to the ballroom floor. I walked right through the center of the room, my white chef's jacket a stark contrast to the black tie finery. I stopped at the head table. Veda looked up at me. Her eyes were hollow, the fire of her control extinguished by the cold reality of her husband's betrayal. You, she whispered. You did this. I just provided the ingredients, Mother, I said, my voice calm and conversational. You and Dad provided the heat. I'm just a chef. I know when a dish is done. Rina lunged toward me, her hands claw-like, but Marcus held her back, more out of a desire to avoid a physical scene than to protect me. You've ruined us, she hissed. Everything we built. For what? A childhood grudge? It wasn't a grudge, Rina. It was a balance sheet. And today I finally cleared the accounts. I turned away from them, ignoring the flashes of the cameras and the frantic murmurs of the crowd. I felt a strange, light sensation in my chest. Not joy, exactly, but a profound sense of completion. The architectural integrity of my family had been exposed as a fraud, and the load-bearing walls had finally collapsed. As I walked toward the exit, my phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. The SUV is gone. Marcus is being served with a subpoena at the hotel exit. Nice work, Kellen. I didn't need to ask who it was. I tucked the phone away and pushed open the heavy doors, stepping out into the cool night air. The black SUV that had been following me was indeed gone, replaced by the flashing lights of two squad cars waiting at the curb for Marcus and Veda to explain the unsecured documents now circulating through the city's legal circles. I walked down the street, the sound of my own footsteps the only thing I needed to hear. The climax was coming. The final confrontation wouldn't be in a courtroom or a ballroom, it would be at the manor, where it all began. And I had a feeling that by the time I got there, the only thing left of the Brooks legacy would be the shadows. The aftermath of the gala was not a quiet affair. It was a loud, messy unraveling that played out across every local news cycle and social media feed in the city. By the next morning, the Brooks Manor was less of a home and more of a fortress under siege by journalists and process servers. I watched the chaos from the comfort of my mentor's kitchen, sipping a coffee that tasted like victory. My sarcastic inner commentary was currently drafting a mock apology letter to the city's elite for the lack of appetizers, though I suspected the scandal had been far more filling than any shrimp cocktail I could have provided. I knew that the psychological weight of the last 24 hours would be crushing for Rina. She had always equated her self-worth with her social standing, and now that her standing was somewhere in the subterranean level of a parking garage, she was vulnerable. It was time for the final isolation. In the culinary world, if you want to break down a tough cut of meat, you don't just hack at it. You marinate it in acid and let it sit in the cold. I spent the morning finalizing the logistical sabotage of Rina's personal life. It was a series of small, calculated strikes designed to make her feel like the world itself was conspiring against her. I started with her sanctuary. Rina owned a vintage cherry red convertible, a car she loved more than most people. I didn't touch the engine. Instead, I used the access I'd gained to her smart home system to trigger a series of cascading errors. Every time she tried to start the car, the alarm would blare for exactly 30 seconds before cutting out. When she locked the doors, the trunk would pop open. It was a ghost in the machine, a persistent, annoying reminder that she was no longer in control of her own environment. I also took the liberty of updating her digital calendar. I filled it with appointments for bankruptcy consultations, ethics hearings, and meetings with public defenders, all links to real firms, though the appointments themselves were ghosts. I wanted her to see her future every time she checked her phone, a long gray line of accountability. By noon, the second wave of isolation began. I reached out to the few remaining associates who hadn't yet jumped ship from the Brooks Development Group. These were the people Marcus had stepped on to climb the ladder, the ones Veda had ignored. I didn't offer them money. I offered them a way to settle their own scores. I provided them with the direct evidence of Marcus's gambling debts and the specific memos where Rina had mocked their professional capabilities. By 2 p.m., the Brooks corporate Slack channel was a digital war zone. Rina was being locked out of her own project folders by disgruntled IT staff. Her personal assistant quit via a public post that detailed every errand she'd ever run for the Brooks princess. The social isolation was complete. She wasn't just a fallen mogul, she was a pariah in a city she thought she owned. I decided it was time for a personal visit to the manor. I didn't sneak in this time. I walked right up the driveway, past the empty space where the black SUV used to sit. The gate was hanging open, a silent testament to the lack of anyone left to guard the perimeter. The front door was unlocked. Inside, the house felt cavernous and cold, the air conditioning still humming at the 55-degree setting I had locked into the system 2 days ago. I found Rina in the library. She was surrounded by piles of documents, her hair a mess, her eyes red and frantic. She looked like a shadow of the woman who had stood on the porch 9 years ago. "Kellen," she whispered, her voice cracking. "What do you want? Haven't you taken enough?" "I haven't taken anything, Rina," I said, leaning against the mahogany desk. "I just opened the curtains. You and Veda built this house out of stolen materials. I just showed everyone the cracks in the foundation. How's the car, by the way? I heard the alarm system is having some personality issues." She let out a harsh, jagged laugh. "You're pathetic. You spent 9 years obsessing over a rainy Tuesday. Do you think this makes you better than us? You're just as calculating. You're just as cold." "The difference is, I'm not lying about it," I said. "I didn't steal a legacy to feel important. I built a life for myself, while you were busy cannibalizing Dad's accounts and Grandma's land. Speaking of which, where is Veda? I'd hate for her to miss the final act." "She's in her suite. She hasn't come out since the gala. She's not speaking to anyone." Rina stood up, her movements shaky. "Marcus is gone, Kellen. He took whatever files he had left and vanished. He's going to pin everything on us. The mall shortcuts, the trust fund. He's going to make us the villains while he plays the whistleblower." "I know," I said. "In fact, I'm counting on it. Marcus is an opportunist, and opportunists always take the easiest path. I made sure that path leads directly to a cooperation agreement with the district attorney. He's currently in a conference room downtown, laying out the entire timeline of the Talren land transfer. Rina slumped back into her chair, the last of her defiance draining away. Why? Why go to this length? You could have just sued us. A lawsuit is a transaction, Rina. This is a transformation. I wanted you to feel exactly what I felt. That moment when you realize the people you trust are the ones holding the shovel for your ditch. I wanted you to see your world shrink until there was nothing left but the truth. I walked over to the window. The sun was setting, casting long, skeletal shadows across the lawn. The house is being seized on Monday, you know. The bank called in the bridge loans after the news broke about the mall's structural issues. You have 48 hours to pack. Where are we supposed to go? I don't know, I said, not turning around. Maybe you can find a place in the rain. I hear it's very enlightening. I left her there, a small figure in a very large, very cold room. I headed upstairs toward Veda's suite. I didn't want a confrontation with my mother. I wanted a signature. I had drafted a final document, a total relinquishment of any claim she had to the remaining Talren assets, returning them to the trust in my name. It was the only way to save the land from the bank's seizure. I knocked on the heavy oak door. There was no answer. I opened it and stepped inside. The room was dark, the only light coming from the moon. Veda was sitting in a high-backed chair by the window, staring out at the city. She didn't look up when I entered. Mother, I said. I saw the video, she said, her voice a hollow rasp. I saw what your father was doing. All those years, I thought he was the weak one. I thought he was the one who needed my protection. He was the one who was smart enough to stay out of your line of sight, I said, placing the document on the small table beside her. He used your arrogance as a shield. While you were looking down at me, he was looking at the ledger. He's gone to Zurich, she said, finally turning to look at me. Her face was a map of exhaustion. He didn't even leave a note, just an empty safe. He left you the consequences, Veda. That's more than you left me. I pointed to the paper. Sign this. It returns the land to the trust. If you don't, the bank takes it on Monday to pay off the mall's creditors. It's the only thing left of Grandma's that you haven't destroyed. She looked at the pen, then at me. For a moment, I saw a flicker of the old Veda, the woman who could command a room with a single glance, but it faded, replaced by a profound, weary resignation. She picked up the pen and signed the document with a trembling hand. Are you satisfied now, Kellen? She asked. Satisfied? I tucked the paper into my jacket. No. Satisfaction is for people who have something to gain. I'm just finished. There's a difference. I walked out of the suite and back down the grand staircase. The house felt like it was already mourning itself. The silence was absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket that seemed to absorb any sound of my departure. As I reached the front hall, I saw Tara standing by the door. She looked pale, but resolute. I'm leaving, Kellen. I've taken what I could of my own files. I'm moving to the coast. Good, I said. There's nothing left here for you, Tara. What are you going to do? She asked. I'm going to go to the kitchen, I said. I have a dinner service to prep. After all this, you're just going back to work? Work is the only thing that's real, Tara. Everything else in this house was just a performance, and the curtain has finally fallen. I walked out into the night. The air was crisp, the sky clear. I felt a sense of lightness that was almost dizzying. The isolation was complete, Rina was broken, Veda was hollow, and Marcus was a pawn in a game he thought he was winning. My family was no longer a legacy, they were a cautionary tale. I took the bus back to my part of town. I sat at the back, watching the lights of the manor fade in the distance. My sarcastic inner voice was quiet now, replaced by a steady, calm rhythm. I thought about the Talren land. On Monday, I would drive out there. I would stand among the pines in the creek, and for the first time in 9 years, it would be mine. Not because I had inherited it, but because I had fought for it. When I got back to my apartment, I saw a package sitting on my doorstep. There was no return address. I took it inside and opened it. Inside was the antique watch collection, the one Rina had accused me of stealing when I was 15. There was a small typed note attached. Found this in the back of the safe. Thought you should have it. See. I held the watch in my hand, the gold cool against my palm, my father's final gesture. Not an apology, not a reconciliation, but a confirmation of the lie that had started it all. He had known the whole time. He had watched me be thrown out for a crime he knew I didn't commit, and he had kept the evidence in his safe for nearly a decade. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel sad. I just felt a profound sense of clarity. The watch was a beautiful piece of machinery, but it was just a tool for measuring time, and my time with the Brooks family was officially over. I placed the watch on the table and went to the kitchen. I had a menu to plan for tomorrow, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't cooking for anyone else's approval. I was cooking for myself. The final confrontation was set. Tomorrow, I would meet with Marcus and the lawyers one last time to finalize the transfer, and then I would disappear into the life I had built, leaving the rubble of the Brooks Empire behind me. The boardroom of Brooks Development Group was located on the 42nd floor, a glass-walled cage that offered a panoramic view of the city my family had spent 30 years trying to own. Today, the view felt less like an empire and more like a crime scene. The air was thick with the scent of stale coffee and the hum of a ventilation system that was struggling to keep up with the summer heat. I sat at the far end of the long mahogany table, my hands resting calmly on its polished surface. Opposite me sat Marcus Lang, looking like a man who had been put through a professional-grade dehydrator. His skin was sallow, his eyes were sunken, and his suit, though still expensive, seemed to be hanging off a frame that had lost its structural integrity. Between us sat the physical remains of the Brooks legacy, 3 thick binders of evidence, a stack of property deeds, and the final transfer papers for the Talren land. This was the peak of the mountain, the place where the air was thin and the masks finally had to come off. My sarcastic inner voice was currently occupied with a detailed critique of the room's lighting. It was too bright, too clinical, like an operating theater where we were about to amputate the family name from the city's ledger. "You really did it, Kellen," Marcus said, his voice a dry rasp. He didn't sound angry anymore. He sounded impressed, which was perhaps the most insulting thing he could have offered. "You played every single one of us. You even played your father, and he's been playing the long game since before you were born." "I didn't play anyone, Marcus. I just stopped participating in the theater," I replied. I leaned back, the leather of the chair creaking under my weight. "You were all so busy trying to outmaneuver each other that you forgot to check if the ground you were standing on was still there. I just pointed out that the floor had been gone for a long time." The door opened, and Veda and Rina walked in. They moved like ghosts haunting their own office. Veda was dressed in a sharp black suit, her spine as straight as a ruler, but her eyes were vacant, fixed on some point in the distant past. Rina, however, was a vibrating wire of nervous energy. She looked at me with a hatred so pure it was almost beautiful. She hadn't slept. The dark circles under her eyes were a stark contrast to the heavy foundation she'd used to try and hide them. "This is it?" Rina spat, gesturing at the binders. "The grand finale? You bring us here to watch you sign a piece of paper? You've already ruined the firm. You've already made us the laughingstock of the coast. What else is there?" "Sit down, Rina," I said, my voice quiet but carrying a weight that forced her into the chair next to Marcus. "We're here to finalize the dissolution, not just of the assets, but of the lies. I want you to see exactly how small your empire really was." I opened the first binder. This is the structural report for the mall project, the one you and Marcus signed off on despite the warnings from the engineers. If that project had moved forward, the building would have shifted within 18 months. You didn't just cut corners, you built a trap. The city has already pulled the permits. The liability alone is enough to ensure that neither of you will ever hold a developer's license again. Rina opened her mouth to argue, but Veda put a hand on her arm. The silence from my mother was more profound than any shout. She knew. She had always known. "The second binder," I continued, sliding it across the table, "is the insurance paper trail. Dad was clever. He knew that as long as the firm had a pulse, he could keep drawing from the line of credit attached to my name. But he didn't realize that I'd already reached out to the underwriters. I told them about the administrative errors in the application. They've canceled the policy. The credit line is gone. The firm is officially insolvent as of 10 o'clock this morning." Marcus put his head in his hands. Rina stared at the documents, her breathing becoming shallow. "And finally," I said, pulling the last set of papers toward me, "the Talren land. The land that Grandma intended for me, which you turned into a piggy bank for your failures. Veda has already signed the relinquishment. This document," I tapped a fresh sheet of paper, "is the final deed transfer. It puts the land back into a private trust, shielded from the firm's creditors. It's the only part of the family history that remains intact." "You think you've won?" Veda said, her first words of the meeting. She looked at me then, her gaze sharp and cold. "You've destroyed your own name. You're a Brooks, Kellen. No matter what you do, no matter where you go, you are the son of a fraud and the brother of a failure. That is your inheritance." "No," I said, picking up a pen. "That's your legacy. My name isn't Brooks anymore. I filed the name change paperwork 3 months ago. I'm taking Grandma's maiden name. From tomorrow, I'm Kellen Talren. The Brooks family ends here, in this room." I signed the papers with a steady hand. The scratch of the pen on the parchment was the only sound in the room. I felt a surge of physical relief, a loosening of a knot that had been tied in the center of my chest for nearly a decade. Now for the final piece of the experience, I said. I stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows. I looked down at the street below. A row of dark vehicles was pulling up to the curb. Marcus, you thought your deal with the investigators was a secret, but you forgot that investigators talk to each other. They don't just want the whistleblower, they want the whole set. Those are the federal auditors. They're here for the records in the basement. The ones you thought you'd scrubbed. Marcus bolted upright, his face turning a sickly shade of white. You told them? You said you wanted to settle the accounts? I did settle them. I settled them with the truth. If you had just been greedy, I might have let you walk away. But you were cruel, Marcus. You helped them toss a 15-year-old into the street for a watch you knew was in the safe. That's a debt you can't pay back with money. I turned to Rina. And you. You spent your life pretending to be a queen. Now you get to see what happens when the subjects realize the throne is empty. You have 15 minutes before they start seizing the digital assets. I suggest you take your purse and leave. There's nothing left for you here. The room descended into a frantic, hushed panic. Marcus was grabbing his briefcase, trying to find an exit that didn't lead to the lobby. Rina was screaming at him, her voice cracking with a desperate, high-pitched fury. Veda remained seated, looking out at the city she had lost, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She looked like a captain who had decided to go down with the ship, even if the ship was only a collection of bad debts and broken promises. I didn't stay to watch the end. I walked out of the boardroom, through the glass doors, and toward the elevators. As the doors slid shut, the last thing I saw was the reflection of my own face in the polished chrome. I looked younger. I looked like a man who had finally put down a heavy burden. I reached the lobby just as the auditors were entering. I walked past them, unnoticed, a shadow moving through a storm of suits and badges. I stepped out onto the sidewalk, the heat of the city hitting me like a physical wave. It was loud, chaotic, and utterly indifferent to the collapse of the Brooks Empire. I walked 3 blocks to a small, quiet park and sat on a bench. I pulled the antique gold watch from my pocket, the one my father had sent me. I looked at it for a long moment, the sun reflecting off the glass. Then, with a flick of my wrist, I tossed it into the deep, dark water of the park's central fountain. It sank without a trace. I didn't need the time. I didn't need the reminder. My phone buzzed. A text from Andre, my mentor. The kitchen is prepped. The new menu looks good. See you at 5? See you at 5, I replied. I stood up and began the long walk toward the bistro. My sarcastic inner monologue was remarkably quiet. For the first time in my life, it didn't have anything to mock. There were no more schemes to hatch, no more secrets to uncover, and no more ghosts to outrun. The revenge hadn't been a fire. It had been a slow, controlled cooling. I had taken the heat out of their lives until there was nothing left but the brittle remains of their own choices. The city moved around me, a million stories unfolding at once. Mine was finally just one of them, no longer tied to the heavy anchor of a manor on a hill. I felt the weight of the Talren deed in my pocket, a promise of a future that belonged entirely to me. As I reached the doors of the bistro, I stopped for a second and looked back toward the skyscraper I had just left. The lights in the top-floor offices were flickering, perhaps as the systems were being shut down or as the authorities began their work. It looked small from here. It looked like a dollhouse with the roof ripped off. I pushed open the door to the kitchen. The smell of roasting garlic and fresh herbs greeted me. The real world, the one I had built with my own hands. "Kellen!" Andre shouted from the back. "The vinaigrette for the salad. It's too acidic. Fix it." "On it, chef," I said, tying my apron. The sarcasm flickered back to life, just for a second. "Too acidic? Please." After today, I'm the world's leading expert on acidity. I picked up a whisk and began to work. The rhythm of the kitchen was the only soundtrack I needed. The Brooks family was a memory, a story told in the past tense. I was Kellen Talren, and for the first time in 24 years, I was exactly where I was supposed to be. There would be no epilogue, there would be no grand reunion. There was only the heat of the stove, the sharpness of the knife, and the next plate. I smiled as I adjusted the seasoning. The dish was finally perfect.